As the title suggests, I want to make a video talking about one of, if not the most important aspects of this game, that being how to deal with every enemy in the game. This isn't going to be exclusively how to kite every enemy, or how to deal with threats in a broad sense. I just want to go through how you deal with individual enemies, including in instances in which you'd likely encounter them. I'm probably going to split this video up into however many segments I feel is reasonable by the end of it, if only because I don't want this to be a couple hours long. So without further ado, let's get into it. The spider is stun lockable, meaning that you can just hold F in order to easily kill one. It can be done with most any melee weapon, but the issue is, spiders are almost always encountered in quantities of 3 or more in spider dens. So here's how to deal with that. First, you walk onto the webbing tile so as to aggro one, then lure it about an additional tile away from where the webbing stops, just to be safe, then kill the spiders one by one during daytime, so as not to be overwhelmed. In large groups, assuming that there's no spider warriors, try to bunch them together in one group, walk into them, bait out a swing from the front row, and then back away. If the spiders who went for the swing are still in the lead of the bunch, hit them once and back away. It's a timely process for large groups, so it's best to isolate them as best you can. This is what I'm going to be referring to as Horde Mentality, and quite a bit enemies tend to spawn in hordes, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed, so spiders are an easy way to practice, since they are very common and the drops are very good. Another one is bees, which I'll cover later in the video, but Horde Mentality is something that you're going to encounter throughout the game, so it's best that you understand how it works and how to deal with them. The Spider Warrior. Bait out the initial lunge by running in a line tangent to the spider's range after baiting out the lunge, or tanking it. The attack rate of the Spider Warrior is inconsistent due to various factors like animation priorities, but you can safely land 5 hits on a Spider Warrior in my experience, before you have to rely on reaction time for them to perform the wind up. In groups, it's very easy to be overwhelmed by spiders and spider warriors. Running away from the spiders until they lose aggro, or at least the spider warriors, is a perfectly valid strategy. But if you do need to deal with groups, it's typically a good idea to follow the same kiting patterns as hordes of spiders, but getting as much distance as possible so that spider warriors don't aggro onto you. Spiders and spider warriors are also naturally hostile towards bunnymen and vice versa, meaning that you could set up a bunnyman farm if you want the drops from the spider without actually having to deal with them yourself. The Tentacle. Bait out their initial swing, back up, then hit them once after they swing twice. Back up, and then repeat until dead. Tentacles are tricky for the sole reason that they're just easy to walk into. To avoid this, watch your sanity meter when it drops quickly and listen for the distinct tentacle noises when you're going through the swamp. Their kiting pattern is easy enough, just be patient and be cautious. Bait out the initial swing, hit the tentacle once, bait out 2 swings. You can easily tell when it's okay to approach based off of the swing noise that they produce. It's a good idea to have minions to help out just to speed up the process, and they also aggro onto everything, so if you want to use them to deal with things that are chasing you, then you know where to find them. It's also not uncommon for things to already be in conflict in the swamp, so if you just want the drops, then you could always just go into the swamp after a couple of days, and typically you're going to find a few tentacle drops as well as merms and spiders. Hounds. Bait out the first swing, then hit the hound twice, back away, and repeat until dead. The kiting pattern for all hounds is the same, but the fire and ice hounds have the added danger of freezing you in place and bursting into fire on death respectively. Firehounds are enemies that you should lure away from any major structures since they pose a threat when dead, which sets them apart from most other enemies. And icehounds can be used to freeze other enemies in close proximity, with the exception of things like other icehounds and things with high ice resistance. So if possible, you should kill them when they're near other threats. The threat of hounds isn't so much that they're tricky to deal with alone, but the tricky part about them is that they spawn in groups and can catch you unprepared in the form of hound waves. Hound waves are threats that you're just always going to have to deal with, so setting up a consistent way to deal with them is advised. This could be done through any variety of hound traps, whether that be something like setting up Pigmen or Bunnymen with a Flingo nearby, the actual hound trap items, or a hound defense in the form of something like catapults or having a Beefalo herd nearby. Things like that would help you a ton as hound waves progressively get more and more difficult as time goes on. Hounds are also fickle beasts, so if you run enough, chances are they'll get aggroed onto something else. And the reason I'm spending so much time covering them and giving you all these options is just because hounds are one of the most common things in the game, and you're going to want to be able to deal with them when they come towards you. Crawling Horror. Bait out the first swing and hold F until your character starts running in one direction. Then bait out the next swing and repeat until dead. Rather than a traditional swing once, bait out the swing, you can actually get a couple hits in if the crawling horror teleports within striking range of you after it gets hit the first time. With good internet connection and low latency, you can also get an initial hit in before the crawling horror actually swings, but the timing is really tight. I personally wouldn't recommend it if you're just learning how to kite, but with enough experience, it's definitely something that could benefit you. These are also some of the most common enemies in the game, so I would highly recommend that you get used to dealing with them. In groups, you have to be very patient and you have to not be greedy if you're trying to do this without taking any damage. In groups, as in if the crawling horrors themselves spawn in groups because you're playing with other people, it's very easy to get overwhelmed, so you have to be patient and not be greedy. If you're trying to do this without taking any damage, the idea is to get hits in where you can, and if there are enough of the nightmare creatures to where they form a big horde, you should bait out the swing of the first throw, then hit once and back up. The timing is going to be very tight and you shouldn't greed in this circumstance, and it's also just a good idea to manage sanity for you and for other players. The Terrorbeak. Same kiting pattern as the crawling horror. Terrorbeaks move faster than the player does unless they're equipped with a walking cane. Terrorbeaks also just spawn alongside crawling horrors when you're insane, and they're definitely a high priority when it comes to killing them. Their high speed is actually great at separating them from the horde of nightmare creatures if they do spawn in a group, making them easier to isolate and kill afterwards. They do, however, have the issue of pushing each other into different enemies, or pushing each other into you, so be on the lookout for that. Terrorbeaks are like crawling horrors, but faster and deal more damage, so learn their kiting patterns and you'll be fine. Krampii. Bait out their first swing and then hit them once, repeat until dead. Krampii are pretty difficult to get the initial hit on. You could bait them by just dropping something like a seed or a stick, and then getting the first hit on them when they try to go pick it up. The timing is also incredibly tight on the Krampii. If possible, I would recommend you just tank them with a high damage reduction armor, or use a different means to kill them like a catapult farm. Krampii are relatively difficult to get to spawn if you aren't intentionally trying to spawn them in, and as a result, they're easy to not spawn if you just limit the amount of naughtiness points that you get. Beefalo. Not initially hostile outside of being in heat. If they're in heat, bait out the first swing, hit 6 times, repeat until dead. If they're not in heat, hit once, bait out the swing, hit 6 times, and repeat until dead. Beefalo are very easy to kite, and they drop quite a bit of meat, making them desirable to kill, but they also spawn in groups. Typically for Beefalo, you can bait one out by just giving them grass or twigs in order to get them away from the herd. If they're in heat, the process is similar, except you just need to patiently and gradually lure one away. Koalaphant / Winter Koalaphant. Same kiting pattern as the Beefalo, hit 6 times, dodge, repeat until dead. They're gotten from hunts, so be prepared for the other outcomes of hunts. The appeal to Koalaphants is that they drop a ton of meat, but that's about it. Batilisks. Bait out the first 2 swings, hit once, dodge, repeat until dead. Their circling pattern makes them initially trickier, but if you run around, you'll notice that one bat in particular will constantly go after you rather than circling, and if you bait out the 2 swings and wait for it to roar, you can hit them. Their low HP means you could kill them in one hit with a weapon that deals 50 or more damage. Bees / killer bees. Stun lockable. If in a group, follow the horde protocol of baiting out the first throw's attack, then sneak in hits while still being cautious, These two have the same kiting patterns and often spawn in hordes, making them great to get practice in on dealing with hordes of enemies. Frog. Hit once, dodge, repeat until dead. This enemy is a threat in spring due to frog rain. In a frog rain horde, try to just avoid aggroing frogs since they do have horde mentality and they can very easily overwhelm you. Due to how they spawn, they're going to spawn constantly around you, meaning that it is very difficult to bunch them up in hordes and deal with them one by one. If you want to deal with frogs in frog rain, you can easily get them to aggro onto Moose Goose. Typically that'll last long enough for you to actually wait out the frog rain. If not, you could always just go to another Moose Goose nest. The pig. Bait out the swing if you have the aggro, due to being a monster or a monster character. Then swing 4 times, dodge, repeat until dead. If non-monster, bait with a meat, and then swing when you get close. Dodge their first hit, hit 4 times, repeat until dead. Getting the initial hit is the tricky part, as well as the pigs trying to kite you. If you only get 3 hits before the pig dodges, then bait out the next swing. Don't try to greed for a 4th if you miss it because it runs away. It's highly recommended that you set up a farm to kill multiple pigs at once, whether you choose to just put them next to merms or killing them one by one. Overall, these are enemies that you should try your best to farm since their drops are desirable. Pigs will also naturally aggro onto almost any monster, so if you're in a position where you're being chased by a lot of pigs, it's not a bad idea to try to get them to aggro onto things like hounds or spiders, or If you're trying to get rid of the aggro on hounds and spiders, then you can run them through pigs. Note that you can stunlock these enemies, but it is very inconsistent to do so and relies on your server latency and attack speed, so I wouldn't commit to it unless you're willing to tank a hit. Guardian Pig. Bait out the first swing, hit once, dodge, and repeat until dead. These enemies are way more aggressive than pigs and have a shorter attack cooldown. They can be stunlocked with the same parameters as normal pigs, but their increased damage is something that I would try my best to avoid. Overall, they're just very annoying. These pigs only loiter around their designated totems, so if you wanted to, you could just completely ignore them unless they're guarding something that you want. If they're guarding something that you want, then you really just have to bite the bullet and deal with them one at a time. Or you could put them to sleep with something like a pan flute, you could freeze them, or you could get an enemy to aggro onto them long enough for you to steal whatever it is that they're guarding within that designated area. Werepig. Bait out the first swing, hit twice, dodge, repeat until dead. They can be stunlocked, and it's a lot more lenient to stunlock werepigs than it is guardian pigs and normal pigs. If you want to risk stunlocking them, be aware that you could get hit as a result of it. Werepigs are easily one of the most desirable enemies to farm, just due to their drops being 2 big meat and 1 pigskin, all of which is really helpful. These spawn in full moons, or you could feed them 4 monster meat in order to force a transformation on a pig or even a guardian pig. Merms. Bait out the first swing, hit 3 times, dodge, repeat until dead. These enemies are faster than pigs and will try to kite similarly. You will not draw aggro on these enemies unless you get too close to their house. Your proximity to them doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. It really just depends on whether or not you get close to their houses. Merm Guards. Same kiting pattern as normal Merms. They deal more damage and have more health if Merm King is up. Otherwise, this is just a worse Merm without the Merm King. The Ghost. Hit once, dodge, repeat until dead. These enemies have an area of effect attack while they're moving and while they're dying, so keep kiting the ghost until it stops emitting light. These don't really drop anything, and they're very easy to avoid, so if possible, I would recommend just not dealing with them. But they can be used to farm werepigs, which can be useful with the right circumstance, that being the right set piece. Clockwork Knight and Damage Knight. Dodge the first swing, then swing twice, dodge, and repeat until dead. You can get 3 hits on a knight with good timing and with low latency, but it's much safer to settle on 2 hits rather than 3, which is why I'm recommending it. Typically the issue with Clockworks is that they spawn in hordes, and these can be very tricky to deal with without taking damage. Clockwork Rook and Damaged Rook. Swing twice, run out of the way to avoid the charge, follow after the Rook, wait for it to do its taunt animation, swing twice, and repeat until dead. Their kiting pattern is somewhat inconsistent, just because of the fact that you could get certain hits in while he's winding up for the charges, but I wouldn't greed for more than 1 hit if you manage to catch him while he's charging up. After day 4, you could lure rooks into running into trees in order to try to spawn a tree guard, and the tree guard would almost definitely kill a rook as long as it's a big one. Alternatively, you could just use it to normally farm trees if you're willing to. However, there are a lot of better options, so I wouldn't really recommend this. Rook's charges also cause damage to nearby enemies that they run into, so be sure to exploit that if you can and where you can. Clockwork Bishop and Damage Bishop. Impossible to kite without speed boosts. With speed boost, avoid the first projectile by running out of the way once it fires. Hit once, run away, then change angle as it fires to dodge the projectile. Run back, hit once, and repeat until dead. You can cause bishops to stop firing by catching them on fire, so if you have a torch on you, you can swing once with that, land about 4 hits before you have to reignite them, and can repeat the process until it dies. This does have the risk of burning the bishop's loot, but it can help tremendously if you're just trying to kill the enemy as soon as you possibly can. These should be high priority on your kill list in things like the ruins, since their projectiles essentially means that you take free damage if you're dealing with multiple threats at once. This is one of the enemies I'd highly recommend tanking, since the alternatives either take too long or run the risk of burning the loot, which, depending on your point in the game, might be worth it depending on the scenario. Tallbird and Teenbird. Bait out the first swing, hit twice, dodge, hit twice, and repeat until dead. Tallbirds could be some of the first enemies that you'll encounter that have high damage and high health, so it's important to not underestimate them. But their drops are also good sources of food, so don't be afraid to try and kill them. Each world also has a chance of spawning what is known as a Tallbird fort, and this is basically just a big cluster of Tallbird nests and Tallbirds surrounded by rocks. This structure can be exploited to kill early game bosses, as well as just dealing damage to big threats. So it's important to make note of where it is, even if you're not going to use it as a food source. I have a whole video going more in depth over whether or not Tallbirds are worth farming for food, so if you want to learn more about this mob, then be sure to check that out. The Buzzard. Bait out the first swing, dodge, swing twice, and repeat until dead. Only possible to kill them this way if the vulture is locked onto food, and they're pretty easy to kill, but their attack animation is very quick, meaning that you don't have much time to react. If you just don't want to deal with buzzards at all, just don't have food or rot on the ground. It's not too hard to not deal with them, but if you're willing to kill them, then they could be a source of food. The Catcoon. Swing 5 times, if it's not dead, bait out the swipe, hit once, wait for the swing animation to be over, so pause a little bit, and then dodge. Usually you can kill a Catcoon with most any weapon, including an axe at 26.7 damage within the first 5 swings, but if you can't for whatever reason, I don't know, maybe you're playing Wes, the timing for killing a Catcoon is incredibly tight and requires you to both not commit to a second swing and not try to dodge too quick lest you be hit by its lunging attack. I'll be real, I didn't expect Catcoons to be that hard. You know, Catcoon's got hands if you can't kill it in 5 swings. The Gobbler. It's stun lockable. It will try to outrun you, but it can easily be baited by just dropping a berry to lure it over, at which point you could interrupt its path and just kill it. It's recommended that you have a bait pen in your base in case you're setting up a berry bush farm, since this could be the means to avoid losing all of your berries to a couple of gobblers, as well as just giving you passive meat in the form of drumsticks. No idea. These will outrun you, but you can just follow it until it stops running to land more hits on it. It doesn't attack, so just hold F and chase after it, and try to corner it if you can. There's not really much of a reason to kill the no-idea. If you kill them without them running into trees, then they're not going to drop their horns whenever it's winter and they have their horns, which really is the thing that you want to get from the no-ideas. Lureplant. Lureplant and the Eyeplants. Bait out the first swing of the Eyeplants, then swing once, dodge, and repeat until dead. Your goal is to make a path that just leads to the center fleshy bulb, and once you get to the fleshy bulb, you just have to hold F until it breaks. Having a weapon that deals 30 or more damage will one-shot the Eyeplants, which is really useful and cuts back on a ton of time. As far as Lureplants go, the 2 biggest uses that people end up finding for them is farming with them, that being setting up a Lureplant farm, or setting up a leafy meat farm on a boat by just planting Lureplants on it. The Mosquito. This is stun lockable, bait out the first swing and hold F until it's dead. It's more annoying than anything else, but they're easy enough to kill and they can result in 8 free healing. I wouldn't put too much thought into mosquitoes, they're just annoying. Not much else to say about that. Voltgoat and Charged Voltgoat. Gain aggro, whether that be through running it to a corner or hitting it with a projectile. Bait out the first swing, hit twice, dodge, and repeat until dead. It's very beneficial to set up a farm for these as their horns are pretty desirable, and they are a very good source of big meat. There's a lot of mechanics that go into Voltgoat herding and farming, so I'll probably just link somebody else's guide on how to set up a good Voltgoat farm. The Charged Voltgoat has the same kiting pattern, except it is a lot more punishing, and it immediately aggroes onto the player. It also deals lightning damage, so if you're wet, you will take extra damage, so I would highly recommend you wear a raincoat if you're fighting a Charged Voltgoat. Bunnyman / Beardlord. Hit once to draw aggro, bait out the swing, attack twice, and then repeat until dead. Eventually they will try to run away, but you can just wait for them to sleep when it's daytime, or wait for them to stop running and finish them off. They spawn in clusters a lot of the time, but aren't hostile unless you have meat in your inventory or you are a monster. These are easily relocatable and nocturnal, making them excellent for dealing with bats at cave entrances. So if you can, hammer down a couple of their houses and put them over cave entrances that you frequently go to. These are also really good at dealing with spiders, so if you want to set up a Bunnyman spider farm, it's probably a good idea too. Mactusk Sons. These are unkiteable without speed boost due to the high speed projectiles that they spit out. Running straight for Mactusk will cause them to run away, and you will eventually outrun both Wee Mactusk and the Hounds, leaving you able to easily kill Mactusk when he tries to go back home. Killing the Ice Hounds will render Mactusk and Wee Mactusk unable to attack if they are within the freezing range. Once you get the first hit on them though, they are stun lockable. However, recently, they have been able to tank a couple hits before walking away. So just be aware of that. The Pengull. These are unkiteable due to them moving while attacking as their only form of damage. It's recommended that you just ignore them, since they're not hostile until near the end of winter. They can also clear out Hounds with relative ease early on, so if you get Hounds to aggro onto them, it's very useful and a very quick way to deal with Hound wave. They spawn ice near where they set up nests, which is useful filler and it's used in the Flingomatic. So do make note of where they are, and they will not get hostile whenever you try to mine their ice. Rock Lobster. Swing once to draw aggro, dodge, swing 4 times until it either swings or shields itself, wait out the shield, bait the swing, then swing 4 times, and repeat until dead. These are not worth fighting, and I cannot stress that enough. Their high regeneration and great tankiness makes these things a big drain on weapon durability and time. Their drops aren't the greatest and can be easily gotten elsewhere. On top of that, whenever they're in their shield form, they have a 95% damage reduction and they restore health at an insane rate, meaning unless you're a Wolfgang or unless you're hitting them with blow darts constantly, you are not going to be able to out damage their healing. And even if you are those characters, they're only going to be taking 9 hits of damage at a time for each 100 damage. It is insane how much damage these guys can tank. But that also makes them easy to deal with things like Fuel Weaver or Ancient Guardian or any other threats, since you can hire them. Splumonkey. Chase after them until they die. They'll throw poop that will drain your sanity, but they will not directly attack you. The issue with these is that they spawn in hordes, and they do have mob mentality, meaning if you hit one of them, all the other ones are going to start flinging poop at you. The Shadow Splumonkey. Bait out the first swing, attack once, dodge, and then repeat until dead. Splumonkeys and Shadow Splumonkeys are easy to deal with individually, but the real threat is in hordes. Shadow Splumonkeys will push one another forward while trying to attack, making them a very big threat. Due to the fact that they spawn in large hordes, they can easily stun lock you, and typically if you get hit once, you'll get hit by all of them, and just get stun locked. Make them incredibly dangerous. If you encounter a group of Shadow Splumonkeys, I would highly advise that you just run. Shadow Splumonkeys are some of the best sources of beard hair and nightmare fuel in the game. So, if you have the means to do it, then Splumonkeys might be worth farming, but their danger level is so high that I cannot in good conscience recommend it unless you know what you're doing. Cave Spiders. These are stun lockable. They will eventually hide, but you can attack them through it. It's recommended you do this with a weapon with high or no durability, as it will deal less damage but will still use up the durability if you're attacking it while it's in its shield form. You can wait for them to peek out of their hiding mode, but if you're dealing with just one, you might as well hold F until it dies. If you're dealing with a horde, you could also abuse the fact that they hide after a couple hits by hitting them a couple times, then shifting aggro onto a different enemy while it's hiding. The Spitter Spider. Dodge a first hit and run into the spider, then bait out the melee swing, swing 4 times, dodge the melee swing, and repeat until dead. These things have incredibly tight timing to the point where it's borderline impossible to actually do this damage list without a speed boost. It is possible, but it requires almost perfect timing. I would honestly just recommend tanking these. Their kiting patterns are so incredibly tight that you're just better off tanking it. These are projectile enemies. Most projectile enemies you just want to tank just to make sure that they're not a factor anymore. And these spiders are no different. The Dangling Depth Dweller. Same kiting pattern as the Spider Warrior. Bait out the initial lunge by running in a line tangent to the spider's lunge. And after baiting out the lunge or tanking it, the attack rate of the spider is very inconsistent due to various factors like animation priorities, but you can safely land 5 hits on the Dangling Depth Dweller before it becomes unsafe to do. Dangling Depth Dwellers are also easily avoidable, since they only come down whenever something runs on their nests. So as long as you see their nest, you could just avoid them. The Depth Worms. Bait out the first swing, hit twice, dodge its bite, swing 5 times while it's doing its long tunnel / taunt animation, then dodge its next swing, and repeat until dead. It sounds more complicated than it actually is. Typically when these spawn you can get them to aggro onto Bunnymen, since Bunnymen will naturally aggro onto Depthworms. And in a lot of scenarios this is kind of easier to deal with than Hounds, since it is very easy to sync up large amounts of Depthworms. The Slurper. Bait out the lunge and start following after the Slurper once they're past you. Then swing 6 times, bait out the lunge, and then repeat until dead. Typically you can kill these in one cycle if you have a 50 or more damage weapon. If they do latch onto you, you have to unequip them from your head slot, otherwise they will drain your hunger at a very quick rate. The Slurtle. Swing once, bait out the bite, swing up to 6 times before it goes back in its shell. From there, you could just hold F for however long it takes for you to kill it, or you could wait out its shell, bait out the bite, swing up to 6 times, and then repeat until dead. You can catch these on fire if you want to just get rid of them. If you do choose to go this route, then they'll just explode, so don't be within their radius. Overall, these are just kind of annoying to deal with. The Slurtle. Stun lockable due to its hiding in its shell. This enemy doesn't attack, so it's perfectly fine to wait out its shell or just hit it while it's hiding. The Centipede. Bait out their first swing. Be sure to give them quite a wide distance, otherwise it will trigger their AoE attack. Hit 6 to 7 times, dodge, and repeat until dead. You can safely land 6 hits against them, but if you are willing to risk a bit more, you can hit them for 7. It's recommended that you give them quite a long range, just because they have a second attack where they do a little ground pound, and that attack has more range than their normal swipe. Centipedes are incredibly easy to ignore since they drop aggro pretty quickly and aren't too quick all things considered. They also don't drop anything on death, so it's not really worth dealing with them unless they're inconveniencing you directly. The Mush Gnome. Hit 6 times, bait out the spores, safely defuse the spores by running into it and out of the group of spores, then swing for as many times as you're able to until he spits out another set of spores. This all really varies on how far the Mush Gnome walks away, what he walks into, and how quickly you can defuse the spores. If you have another ally like pigs, merms, or even Hutch, you can guide them through to detonate all the spores and swing at the Mush Gnomes as much as you can. The spores have a somewhat deceptive range, so do be cautious whenever you're dealing with them. Typically, if you get hit by one, you're going to get hit by a couple other ones that are nearby. So try to avoid that as much as possible. The Naked Mole Bat. If they're hostile, bait out the first swing. If they're not hostile, hit once, wait out the bite, and then swing 3 times. Dodge, then repeat until dead. If you're having trouble with hitting 3 times, you can swing twice, which makes it a lot safer at the cost of a little bit of damage. Due to their proximity to Mush Gnomes, it is not uncommon for them to aggro onto the Mush Gnome, which could help you out on baiting out the spores as mentioned when talking about the Mush Gnome. Shattered Spider. Bait out the range attack, hit 4 times, dodge, repeat until dead. Shattered Spiders have a ranged attack that is notorious for missing a lot of the times, so I wouldn't be too worried when it comes to Shattered Spiders and just ignoring them, but they do latch onto you for a long extended period of time, so it's really hard to shake them. If you're trying to clear out the Moon Spider dens, it's better to just tank the spiders that come out of it and constantly mine at it. Otherwise, the spiders are just going to keep spawning, and you're only going to be able to get like 1 or 2 hits before you have to deal with spiders all over again, which is a very time-intensive process. You could also just use gunpowder to blow up the dens. Salamander. Hit once to draw their aggro, bait out the swing, hit twice, dodge, repeat until dead. The fiery salamanders have the same kiting pattern, though they have the added danger of catching nearby structures on fire, so try to do this out in an open field. These 2 enemies have varying drops, one of them dropping leafy meat on death, that being the green salamander, and one of them dropping a dragon fruit, which could be very good ways to get dragon fruit early on. The Moonrock Pengull. These are unkiteable due to them being a moving hitbox, so the same reason as normal Pengulls. These are naturally aggressive towards the player and only spawn in winter, and should be avoided since they only drop ice, which is easily available during the season anyways. The Nurse Spider. This is stun lockable. They're high priority kills when dealing with spiders, since they will just AoE heal nearby spiders and spider queens, making them significantly harder to deal with, so kill them when you can. Catching them on fire could also be worth it. Webbers could benefit from these, so call them out if you see them and you're playing with a Weber. Their spiders only spawn when there is a spider queen nearby, making them very tricky to deal with. The Sea Strider. These are also stun lockable. The issue with Sea Striders isn't just in their quantity, but inherently due to them being in the ocean, you also have a lot less space to work with when trying to kite them in horns. They only have 200 health, so if you have a weapon that deals over 50 damage, you'll be able to kill them in 4 hits, which makes them easier to deal with. They also move slower when on land and on your boat, so you could use that to your advantage to make kiting them easier. Grass Gator. Draw aggro with a ranged weapon, then bait out the first swing, hit 6 times, dodge, and repeat until dead. These enemies avoid the player and don't really drop anything too important, that being leafy meat, grass, and twigs, and also avoid the player really well. They're the same kiting pattern as Beefalo, and honestly, I wouldn't say that they're too worth dealing with just because their drops aren't really stellar, and because it's very hard to get the initial hit on them. The Misshapen Bird. Dodge the range attack. Other than that, same rules apply for the Misshapen Bird. These deal a deceptive amount of damage, so it's still recommended that you wear armor since the pokes and prods that they deal add up over time. The bottom line is just swap to Wendy. The Moonstorms are really annoying to deal with. Having an Abigail nearby is insanely helpful. I would highly recommend it. The Moonblind Crow. This only has 10 HP, so it's very easy to deal with, but if you, for whatever reason, can't deal 10 HP of damage, you should bait out the first swing, hit them once, dodge, repeat until dead. They spawn in groups, but they walk slow and their range is less than the players, meaning that they're very easy to deal with. Just attack from outside the horde and move your way inside gradually. It can be overwhelming since this is just another thing to worry about in Moonstorms. I would recommend just swapping to Wendy to have Abigail kill the birds for you. You can also hire rabbits since those automatically aggro onto hostile enemies, as opposed to how Merms and Pigmen are. If these guys see any of the birds, then they will instant aggro onto them. The Cookie Cutter. Dodge the lunge onto the boat, swing twice, dodge, repeat until dead. Or hit the Cookie Cutter as it's approaching the boat, and repeat that process until it dies. The threat isn't necessarily the Cookie Cutters themselves attacking you, the threat is in them puncturing your boat. Killing these before they could dig a hole into your boat is highly recommended, so it's a smart idea to have a weapon that deals 50 or more damage, so you can kill them as they come aboard. This can get overwhelming, but you should keep track of who latches onto your boat first, and deal with that Cookie Cutter in particular as they come. I would recommend having boat patches just in case, because these, once again, are just a threat to your boat. Skitter Squids. These are stun lockable. They travel in groups, and they have a special debuff. If you get hit by their ink, don't panic and just run the opposite direction of where they were. Otherwise, follow the same horde protocol of sneaking in hits when and where you can. The Rockjaw. Draw aggro with a projectile, bait out its first swing, hit twice, dodge, repeat until dead. Rockjaws go for a second attack cycle inconsistently, so it's better to be safe than it is to be sorry, and just go for the hit twice rather than greeting for more hits. It's also very possible to just ignore the sharks. If you're fishing and a shark spawns on you, it's best to try and draw its aggro and kill it as soon as you possibly can, so it doesn't steal your fish. Narwhale. Boat patches are required for this fight. First you need to gain its aggro via projectile or approaching it and then hitting it with a melee attack. This will cause the narwhale to stick its horn through the boat, which you can just attack from to break, and you get the narwhale horn item from it. The narwhale will then just run away, so if you want it dead rather than just wanting the horn, chase after it and hit it until it dies. It won't attack you directly, but it will cause waves that will get you wet. Seaweed. These are stun lockable. It's not recommended that you engage in combat with these as they have Horde Mentality, and all their attacks do damage to your boat in the form of leaks. Their Horde aggro range is moderately sized, so if you see one that is a fair distance away from the rest, you can isolate it and kill it without aggroing nearby enemies. But overall, I wouldn't recommend dealing with these. They're more trouble than they're worth. The Terror Claw. Same process of kiting nightmare creatures. Bait out the first swing, hold F until your character starts running in a different direction, bait out the next swing, and then repeat until dead. Their range is approximately half of the boat, so be aware of how big their hitboxes are. Otherwise, these aren't too scary and you can deal with them pretty easily. The Powder Monkey. Swing twice, dodge, wait out them running away until they approach you again, dodge their swing, hit twice, and repeat until dead. It's recommended that if you're going to kill a powder monkey, you isolate them as much as you can and stay isolated so as to not trigger a horde mentality. I wouldn't recommend killing them in the first place, if you can, since the cursed trinkets can be annoying to deal with. Powder monkeys will steal your items, so it's recommended that during your time on Monkey Island, you just have the first couple slots of your inventory filled with something like rot or pine cones. Just something that's easily replaceable to you. Primates. These are unkiteable due to not having an attack cooldown aside from their animation. I'd recommend just tanking every enemy on the boat that these things spawn in, just because of how annoying they are to deal with. They'll just steal all your junk and try to leave, so if you value your stuff and don't want to go looking for the buried treasure, I'd recommend just biting the bullet and going for the kill as soon as possible, and then dealing with the consequences later on. Though if there isn't anything in your boat other than one or two things, then it might just be better to let them take it. Overall, the choice is up to you. You might have noticed that I skipped a couple of enemies such as Spider Queen and Vargs and most things that people would classify as mini bosses, and that's because in order to save time, I decided to cut them out of this video and put them in a different one. I'll also be doing the same thing with bosses, so be sure to tune in because I do plan on uploading those pretty soon. You might have noticed that I had skimmed over a couple of bosses. You might have noticed that I skimmed over a couple of enemies as well as bosses. This is because their process is a lot more involved and a lot more complicated most of the time, so I'm planning on putting those into a different video. I'll have a link in the end card of this video to those videos when they are out. So If you're waiting for those to come out, then be sure to subscribe. It really does mean a lot, and I appreciate it. This was definitely a big project, and I really appreciate you guys sticking with me on this one. But until next time, bye-bye.